We're going to look at how magazines went from general interest, we'll look at the decline of general interest, into the specialized, what we have now. And we can see how many magazines transitioned through this time. One thing I want you to keep in mind is that newspapers, even though older, were not a mass medium yet. Magazines are actually became a mass medium before newspapers. So newspapers were very local yet. So magazines were more for everyone versus information on a local level. And that brings us to one that I know most of you are familiar with, is Cosmopolitan. And just the idea of them reinventing themselves over the years. In 1886, it was originally a woman's child-rearing guide, as well as house decorating and home guide, as well as some cooking. And then in 1905, Hearst bought it and it became a muckraking magazine. So sales had gone down, and in the 1960s, completely reinvented themselves. And there was an editor, Helen Gurley Brown, and she just changed the way that the magazine was going to run. And that's where we have more of that traditional, what we know of as that fun, fearless female type of, articles, covers, as you can see here, very much promoting women. So moving into early history magazines, coming from Europe, mainly political magazines at this point, and then a gentleman's magazine in London. And this was the first time the word magazine was used. And all they did was took over reprinted articles, typically from the newspapers or political guides, and put them into this magazine that was then circulated. Colonial Magazine, so here in the U.S., were very slow. We have to understand at the time where we were, there was no real literacy, the printing press was not developed yet, and meaning there was no middle class. So it was only the elite that could afford, and the worker bees, if you want to say. Philadelphia was the first place to have a magazine by Andrew Bradford, the American Magazine, and then Benjamin Franklin also created the General Magazine and Historical Chronicle, which you'll still see Historical Chronicle today at many places. So in the 1800s, it did get a little bit more specialized, but it was much more specialized on those who paid for again and those who had the knowledge. So religion, literary periodicals, so professions such as doctors, lawyers, would have those very specialized magazines. In 1821, the Saturday Evening Post was developed, and that was pretty much the first general interest magazine, although it did appeal to women with this advice column that they used. Women magazines started to appear. They really tapped into women being the guide of the home as well as the purchaser of home goods. And these were developed and really sort of guided women as to how they should act, what they should be like. And we're going to see this a little bit more when we get into advertising as well. In the 20th century, magazines go national. So there was a lot of things that happened, printing press, obviously, and everything was going forward. So increase in literacy, public education, improvement in printing, postal technology was improved, and there started to be pictures, illustrations in magazines. So it could be it could have been drawings, and then it got into photography, photographs, which actually paved the way into what we'll talk about soon is photojournalism. Here's an example of The Nation, which is one of the oldest magazines, 1865, and still today. Going into modern American magazines, Postal Act of 1879 lowered postage rates, so distribution costs fell, magazines flourished, and by this time now, advertising really took hold, and was able to build a national marketplace and captured audiences' attention from these magazines because it was a national mass medium at this point. Magazine costs went from 35 cents down to 10 cents, and which allowed more people to read. Again, more information, more knowledge. In 1906, Teddy Roosevelt coined a term called the muckrakers. And what that did is really expose social ills of what was happening within society. It could have been a local situation, or they could have been looking at it on a grander, more national scale. And this really led to an early form of investigative reporting, including reforms such as the Pure Food and Drug Act, Meat Inspection Act, progressive income tax. So many things that the public would not have been aware of if not for these longer, lengthy articles, a little bit different than a news article, which are sort of short and quick. General interest magazines really rose from the 1920s to the 1950s. They would use investigative journalism, there would be some broad topics, so it was more for everyone. Photojournalism took hold. The idea of using photographs to implement or augment editorial content. And this is where magazines gave this visual advantage over radios. The nice thing about magazines is, again, they were able to investigate and give that longer story, very much different than a radio news art or a news hour or half hour, or even going into the newspaper where the articles are quite short. Here's a few examples of successful general interest magazines, and you're going to still see a lot of these still around today. So Saturday Evening Post, information there, 1821, really looked at American virtues through words and pictures, and first magazine to reach 2 million in the 1920s, and that's circulation throughout the whole entire country. That is a lot of people. It's a lot of magazines, and we'll learn that magazines have a great pass around readership, which means it gets passed on, or pass on readership. Reader's Digest, I don't believe they're here anymore, but what they did, and still until they ended in the 80s, is they just condensed articles from other places. Could have been from a newspaper, could have been from another magazine, it could have been anywhere. So they really put it in. The nice thing about the Reader's Digest, what appealed to people, it was the size. So it was considered a pocket size, so people could carry it around. You could put it in your purse, read it whenever you wanted. So very popular in the 40s to the 80s. Other ones is Time. We have Time still today. And that really uses interpretive journalism, where the reporter is researching the terms, they are getting interviews, circulation of 2 million, and this is pretty much when news magazines took over photojournalism. Time is still available, and it comes out once a week. It's a fast publication, so their deadlines would be very much quicker than a monthly magazine. Life, another one, very oversized. It was a big size, bigger than a typical magazine, and really big on photojournalism. Beautiful pictures, and again, really had that pass-along readership of over 17 million, which means not only subscribers, but also anyone where at a doctor's office, at the garage when you were waiting, before cell phones, you would read magazines. Coming to the end here is where we're going to see the decline of general interest magazines.